I am Libby Weitnauer. Thank you so much for joining. Tonight we're going to be talking about uh, the ballad "16 Kings' Daughters," which has I've had the chance to record, and then had the wonderful chance to work with Anne Beal. Anne, if you could raise your hand.
Hey.
She animated and directed this film that we're going to be watching and talking about tonight. And I'll just give you a little background and then I'll introduce everyone. So, the background of this event and the music is that I am a musician primarily. I don't really consider myself like a researcher, even though I often study traditional music, which those kind of go hand in hand. But part of that is, as a musician, I was really excited about the idea of looking into Blount County music because I grew up in Maryville, and I was reading some old papers about Cades Cove specifically and Blount County music, and I came across Dr. Horne's name, and we'll be talking about her later, but she was a music professor at Maryville College who worked with a student to collect songs around Blount County back in the 30s, and that is how we have the piece that we'll be working with tonight. So I came across that and kind of put my own spin on it. So it's not a historical performance, but it kind of has a modern take on an old song. But we're gonna watch that in just a moment, and then I'll speak about some of the musical history, and then I'll have Anne Beal, the film's director and animator, will talk about her choices as she was animating. And then we'll have Tim Walker speak about Miss Vina Cooper, who is the source for this song. Then Amy Lundell, who is the archivist at Maryville College, is going to talk about the collection, the Horne and Hamby collection that the song came from, which I'm really excited to learn more about. But she was really helpful when I found out about this collection, and I emailed the Maryville College archivist and was like, "Where is this? I need to see this." Like, Dr. Horne is someone I've always been interested in. I can't believe that she has a collection of old songs like this. And then we'll finish off the night with Dr. Aaron Astor, and he'll talk about the migration of people in Blount County from the mountains into the valley. And as we move along, I'll talk more about how that's related to this topic. I think it'll become apparent, but we're gonna weave a story here about this song and how it's relates to Blount County. So, yeah, let's get started. Um, and Janae, oh, and I should say, all of this is possible because of a grant that the Blount County Friends of the Library was awarded from the Tennessee Arts Commission. And so that's how this film exists. So we're very grateful for that grant. Yeah, I can just talk a little bit about the musical thing. We can kind of switch things around, and that'll be a good intro, actually.
Okay.
While
Cool.
you do that, I'm gonna just go ahead and get into my portion of the presentation. So
Perfect.
as I said, um, I am a musician. I am not necessarily a scholar of ballads. My area of expertise is more fiddle music, but I do know a fair bit about ballads after studying traditional music for the last like 7 years. So I'm just going to give you all a little crash course on traditional music and ballads because that's really going to contextualize what we'll be talking about tonight. Because it's become clear to me that not everybody knows what you mean when you say, "Oh, this ballad was collected from so and so." So I just want to lay out some terms so that we're all on the same page and give you a little bit of background about mountain music in general. So this piece, 16 Kings' Daughters, is a mountain ballad, and it was collected in Blount County from a woman named Vina Cooper. So knowing that, let's just dig in to a little bit of background. So first of all, I just want to define traditional music. You hear that term a lot, and traditional music is a very broad term that can apply to any culture, but we are talking today about specifically the traditional music of Southern Appalachia. And traditional sort of means, well, it comes from the word tradition, right? Which means the transmission of customs or beliefs from generation to generation, or the fact of being passed on in this way. So that's a great way to think about traditional music as well. It's music that is developed in communities, by communities, for communities. It's not music that was necessarily intended to be performance or recorded. Um, you can take like bluegrass and country music. Those are good examples of like commercialized music. So those are intended for the stage, they're intended for radio, they're intended for performance. But what we're talking about is a kind of music that happens at home. This traditional music is often intended for dance, religious worship, uh, knowledge sharing, or just entertainment in the home. And it's kind of defined by music that is passed between people. So these ballads, which is just one subset of traditional music, um, are often passed orally. So they're not typically written down, which is kind of what makes this project special. Is that this particular song was recorded on paper and not to a recording. So I kind of had to build back up what this ballad sounds like, because we don't have any recordings of this ballad besides what uh, the collector, Dr. Horne, wrote down on paper. So um, I'll talk more about my process of building this back up. But anyways, so the song you will hear, 16 King's Daughters, is a traditional ballad. And ballads are, like I said, a specific subset of traditional music. And you can think of them as sort of long form musical stories that were often passed from person to person. And they have a number of functions. So ballads can be just exclusively for entertainment. We have accounts of people in Cades Cove. I was reading about this one family who lived in Cades Cove called the Harmon family, and they were a particularly musical family. And people would come to their house on a Friday night and listen to them sing ballads. So that is one function of a ballad. Is it's just purely entertainment. It's like watching a movie. It's just like a musical version of a storytelling experience. Um, other uses of these ballads were sort of like moral teachings. Like a lot of them were cautionary tales, which that comes up in this ballad, as you'll see. This ballad is like somewhat of a cautionary tale. And then also this ballad does necessarily encapsulate that, but they were also used as like ways to capture current events. So also in Cades Cove in Blount County, there are accounts of songs that retold like a Confederate invasion in Cades Cove, or a local crime. Unfortunately, a lot of those more local stories were lost, because when ballads and the idea of like ballad collecting and documenting became really trendy in the 30s, oftentimes folklorists were only looking for ballads that were centuries old and dated back to England. So they kind of ignored these more local tales. So that brings us to 16 King's Daughters, which is local in that its style is unique to Blount County. But this is a ballad that dates back to what is now the UK in England, hundreds of years. There are many versions of this particular story, but the one we'll hear tonight is specific to Blount County. So what that means is you have all these different ballads, these long form musical stories that get passed around. And so what happens is they form regional versions or even family versions, because people were learning these songs from neighbors, from family members. And so what that means is they're going to change a little bit. There'll be slightly different lyrics, maybe like a different title, a slightly different melody. Maybe some bits of the story will get left out and it'll become more abbreviated. So these ballads are dynamic. They're constantly changing. And so what we're going to hear tonight is a ballad called 16 King's Daughters, but it's related to other old ballads that, like, for example, there's one called Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight. And it's the same story, but a much longer, more elaborate story. This is sort of the Americanized, abbreviated version, probably because someone forgot a verse and sang it to their neighbor. And so this is a Blount County ballad, even though the roots of this ballad date back much farther than that, across the ocean. And let's see. So Vina Cooper, Tim Walker is going to talk about her more later, so I'll just give a brief summary. She lived in Maryville, and that's when saw that Anjanae shared a YouTube link. She lived in Maryville, but she was from Cades Cove, or at least at one point she lived in Cades Cove and moved down into Blount County, she was already in Blount County, moved down into Maryville, and that's where the song was collected at her home. And all that means is that she sang the song for Dr. Horne. Dr. Horne wrote it down, and then basically that's what I had to go off of. And I'm just going to check in with Anne. Anne, how's the film coming along?
Ready to go.
Okay, great.
I'm glad this worked out better. I'm so glad you gave everyone some perspective on what they're going to watch.
Yeah. It could go either way, you know.
It's great.
Not know what you're going to see and then learn something, but actually, before we get started, I'll say one more thing about the ballad, which is that, we'll come back to it because I want to explain how I came to the melody and the interpretation that I did, but maybe that's better said after you've already heard it. So let's fire it up.
All right, I'm gonna do a screen share now.
She had no wings to carry her away or tongue
so much, Anne.
Could everybody hear it okay?
Yeah, I hope it came across all right. And the Anne Janae, the Blount County library director, included the YouTube link in the chat. So if you want to go watch it in more high resolution after this, I would definitely encourage that because it's a beautiful film and did an amazing job with her animation. Um, and
Thanks.
so before I turn this over to our next speaker, I just want to talk a little bit about how I came up with the song that I came up with and what it looked like because it was a paper and not a recording before I made it into music that you can listen to. Um, so one second, I'm gonna share my screen now because I'd like to show you all what the song looked like when I got my hands on it. All right. All right. Can everyone see that? It's shared. Should be. Um,
Yes.
okay, great. So this is one of the many ballads that were in the collection, which Amy will talk about in more detail later. But this is exactly what I had to work with from the collection. As you can see, it says, as dictated from memory by Mrs. Vina Cooper, Maryville, Tennessee, March 6th, 1938. So these are Dr. Horne and Hamby's notes. Um, and see that he followed her up and he followed her down. He followed her to the bed where she lay. So these are the words that I was working with. And if you look down here, you can see that one of the really great things about Dr. Horne is that as a music professor, she was able to notate um, the melodies, which was actually pretty rare for a lot of folklorists uh, at that time in the 30s were just writing lyrics. They didn't really care about the melodies that much, but Dr. Horne did, and so we have three different melodies for the same song. This is Vina's, and then these are two other musicians who I believe she must have collected uh, other versions from, and I kind of had to build um, this from Vina Cooper's because I wanted to match the lyrics with the melody that she attributed to her. And then beyond that, like I said, there are other relatives to this ballad from other places. So, for example, a woman named Sheila K. Adams, who's still very much alive and performing, but she learned music from her parents in Madison, North Carolina. She sings a version of this ballad called Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, and slightly different lyrics, slightly different melody, but between that and then other versions of relatives of this ballad, I kind of pieced things back together and tried to reanimate and bring this Blount County song back to life. So that's how I got to what you just heard. Um, and now I'm going to turn it over to, I believe that uh, Anne is next.
All right.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Anne, who's going to talk about the visual choices made.
Oh, thanks so much, Libby. So I will share my screen and talk about how the video came about. So can y'all see my screen? Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, so I started with basically the same thing Libby started with. I started with those the printed out lyrics that Libby gave me, that she pieced together after doing all the research she did and everything. So I had the words, and then I also had the beautiful recording that Libby made. And from that, I really listened to the song and looked at the lyrics, and I had to sort of get the song in my system before I could decide how I wanted to visualize it, because some of the stuff in there is pretty intense. I mean, it's a really it has the potential to be a pretty traumatic story. So I thought, how do I want to convey this ballad in a way that is like, watchable and like conveys the emotions and, you know, the setting that, especially the setting where Fiona Cooper was. Without, you know, I didn't want to animate anything too literally because I think that it's really important to give this song and the music the spotlight rather than trying to like illustrate everything too literally. So I did a lot of tests and I did a lot of sketches, and the first thing I ended up with was Libby's album cover. And so this is sort of like, you know, I had the film in mind by the time I developed this, but I didn't really have any animation yet. And so once Libby was like cool with this image and really liked the direction it was going, then I felt like I had permission to continue in this direction. And you may recognize this little photo here. Can everybody see this photo of the lake?
Yes.
Can I get a verbal confirmation?
Yes.
Thanks. I can't actually see anyone. Maybe I should make it so I can see the video panel. That way I can like feel like I can see humans. Oh, great. There you are. Okay. So while I was trying to get inspiration for the video, I was like, hey, Libby, like, are you going hiking anytime soon? You know, like, I need some visual inspiration. And I'm from Western North Carolina, so I grew up with this landscape too, but I currently live in Manhattan, and we don't have a lot of mountains in Manhattan. So Libby took this photo, and she took several photos. This one, I use this one a lot, and this one, and these are the main images for that I use to develop the look of the film. And I'm going to show you some stuff. Let's see. This is what part of my desk looks like. And you may recognize these 4 panels from the film. I tried a new technique with this particular film where I divided my frame into 4 sections, and you'll have to forgive me, this is going to get a little bit technical and nerdy, like animation wise, but I think you guys are here for it, so let me know. But I do want to get into it a little bit just to show you some of the technical stuff. So I guess you guys can still see my face, right? This is what the frames look like. And the reason I did 4 scenes on one page is so that I could save paper, which saves money, and it also saves physical space because, you know, with a film that's 3.5 minutes long, if I did every single frame on a different piece of paper, like the pile of paper would become so high. So this is like some of the frames. And I'll show you like some, let's see. It might make more sense if I sort of start with one of the scenes, with one of the first scenes. So I didn't do everything on with 4 scenes on one page, but like here's an example of like the intro scene. This might look familiar. So like there's the houses, or this is actually supposed to be her father's house. So like the intruders like creeping up to the father's house, and the way that it works is like I have lots of frames that look very similar to one another. And then I just loop them. I photograph all of them. And then in this case, I zoom in with the camera to like different parts. So this is like where we start, and then I end up going around, and then we get all of the things. So I won't show you the whole film frame by frame, but this is an example of like what it looks like in the physical process before it gets into the computer. I use a DSLR camera. That's a digital camera, but it's like a pretty nice digital camera. And I use it to capture each of these frames, just taking a picture. So I'm not actually doing any like what you might think of as like, digital animation. I mean, this is hand painted, and I feel really strongly that, I think that Libby and I kind of, and correct me if, feel free to chime in, Libby, but we both like really respect the past and also like how we can make the past approachable to the present. And so my way of doing that is doing painted animation and like preserving the actual physical touch of like a paintbrush to the canvas and like trying to explain or trying to convey emotions through paint. And I mean, I love digital animation too. I like that too, but like there's something really special about connecting with the paint. As you can see here, it's kind of a mess. And then let's see, I have another picture up here. Whoops, that's a picture of Libby.
And in case it's not clear, Anne hand painted every single frame of the film.
Yeah. So let me find that other picture, but I just wanted to sneak this in here because Libby and I used to live in the same place, and we used to play fiddle together for contra and square dances, and I just threw that in there for fun. So there's this one. I know I have another one up here. Oh, here it is. So this is kind of what it looks like. This is another view of the same thing. Like I work on a light box so that I can see the previous frames, previous paintings I did. It's a really like messy process, and a lot of people would say it's really labor intensive, but I genuinely love it. This is what I would much rather be doing than many other forms of work. So like I'm pretty happy that I get to do this. So it can be a lot of work, but it's fun. I really enjoy it. And I have a few more things, but I'd love to, like, if anybody has any questions, like, or if you have questions, Libby, like, while I'm sharing on my screen, like, let me know.
Sure. Yeah, I'm trying to also uh, share the lyrics so that everyone can. Like, it occurred to me that maybe not hearing the words one time probably isn't enough. Um, yeah, I'm curious uh, how you decided on the color palette that you chose because it's so vibrant for such a dark topic, which is why I'm trying to find the words so that everyone can read them and compare and contrast sort of the color palette of your
Oh
film.
yeah, well I could kind of go through, hold on. Uh, I'll open up the video that has the words right under it.
Okay,
And you
great.
can, oops, hold on.
The story is one of essentially an attacker. A woman is attacked and she fights them off and turns the tables, and that's pretty unusual for ballads. A lot of ballads in they don't end great for the woman. We'll just say that much.
Yeah.
In the mountain ballads, which is why I mentioned the bit about the cautionary tales because um, that was part of the uh, thinking behind them was these cautionary tales, both to men and women, um, about essentially like what would happen if you misstepped.
Yeah, exactly. So I am gonna undo all the weird stuff. Sidebar, you can apparently draw on your screen, and I just did that accidentally. Can everybody see where I'm at right now with the,
Mhm. Yeah.
so you can see followed her up and you followed her down. Okay, let's see. I just don't know why this is there. Okay. So I'll just go through, okay, so we start with she's going up to the thing. Okay, he followed her up and he followed her down. He followed, and another thing about adding captions to animated videos is there's really an art to it. And I'm not sure if I've learned that art yet, but I would be really curious to know, how did the captions work for everybody?
They work great. I think they look great.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
the idea is that you can watch this and experience the like feeling of the film, even if you're like hard of hearing, you'd be able to read the film as it happens. So he followed her up, he followed her down, he followed her to the bed where she lay. She had no
Yeah.
wings to carry her away.
And then we're trying to say no yay. And I figured the best, like, I kept thinking about how to represent this scene because, like I said before, it's really um, terrible. And, and I said, well, I'll have a dress, I'll have a nightgown, and that'll just be like some symbolism that I'll hold on to, and then, it falls down. Um, and another thing about this is an interesting thing to think about historically with archiving. I know we have, professional archivists that can talk about this better than me, but I did want to say, as the animator, grammar, like I was really, having trouble. I was like, I know or tongue to say no yay is not a complete sentence, and I wouldn't normally capitalize O on or, but the way that this ballad is written is just like kind of a series of statements. And I guess as an archivist, like, you have to decide, like, I mean, I guess maybe ethically you should keep it exactly as you heard it, but like, how do you know if anyway,
No,
that would be something I'd love to hear from you, like from Amy about.
well, I even want to interject. I would definitely be curious to hear that from Amy as well. But these words are exactly as Dr. Horne recorded them. Um, so no one had to make those decisions besides Dr. Horne, but it's totally possible that there was a typo. And that's also something when we're looking at traditional music, um, people make mistakes, and so that's part of how these ballads they sort of evolve over time is kind of just a series of human errors, really.
And that's so true, Libby. And one, I will have to admit to one thing, which is at the beginning, when she goes in, or when the intruder goes in and takes her out, it says like 3 hours. And then, like, the line. What is it about 3 hours? Something about 3 hours. And then at the end, it's 2 hours. Like, she gets home 2 hours before it was day.
Yeah, she says they left 3 hours before it was day, and then the whole story takes place, and then
And
they were
an
2 hours.
hour, and then she's back. Yeah, exactly. So in the transcription, it says two, TOO, but we know that it's two, TWO, and that's a decision that I had to make because I was like, well, like, I don't know, I know it's supposed to be two, so I put two here at the end, because it's like 2 hours, 2 long hours before it was day. This was spelled TOO, so I don't know if
Yeah,
maybe that would be a mistake, but I'm pretty sure it was like
yeah, that
that.
was a typo for sure.
So yeah. Anyway, that's
I had a quick question. Could I
Yeah,
ask a
please.
quick question? One of the lyrics mentioned Derby Boy, Derby, and
Darby Bay.
Darby Bay. He sang it as Darby Bay, but the lyric said, I know Derby is pronounced Darby,
Mhm.
but the Bay Boy, I wasn't sure. I'm not sure where exactly that lyric was, but it was
yeah. I'll find it. I know what you're talking about.
Um,
okay.
I just want to also interject to say that I just put the lyrics into the chat box. I should have. It occurred to me that those are very important. So if you are interested
There
in
you
the
go.
lyrics along as we talk about it, please feel free to open that link up. Um, but yes, so in Dr. Horn's transcription, she notes Derby pronounced Darby.
Yeah.
So that's how I got that. In fact, I might even share my screen with these lyrics while we talk about that, if that's okay.
Yeah,
That's
sure,
that's
sure. I
common in
can
English at the
let's
time.
unshare.
To pronounce Derby as Darby, it's like clerk as Clark. That was pretty common. But the
Right.
boy or bay part was the one I was curious about.
So, yes, so that was a decision that I made,
Okay,
um, to rhyme with day. That was like a performance
gotcha.
decision. So,
Okay.
um, I'm just gonna leave this up here while I'm talking a little bit more. So, like I said, I there are no recordings of this exact version of this song, which is really special that um, the library and myself, along with the Tennessee Arts Commission, were able to create a recording of this, even though, admittedly, this sounds nothing like how it would have sounded when Bina Cooper was singing it. I do think that I got pretty close melodically to what it would have sounded like, but obviously, the spacey sounds and the pedal steel you hear in the background, those are modern choices that I've put on top of this old song. Um, and so traditionally, this song would have just been sung, just Vina singing this story. I'm just gonna slowly go down. And so choices like exactly like turning boy to bay, um, because there are bay horses. I rhymed with day. I didn't change any other lyrics that I'm aware of, but that was one, to make it flow a little bit better. Anita and Carl raised their hand. Yes.
No, but please, did you at least consider changing 7th to 17th?
I did. I did. Yes. That one is pretty brutal. Okay, so
Yeah.
because that one is like that one, the reason I didn't change it is because lyrically it adds what's the word? A syllable. um so I kept it the way it was. I'm trying to
I
scroll.
was so I had so I kept so another funny thing when I was listening to Libby sing this song a million times over and over, and it was so it's thank goodness that Libby's voice is so beautiful because I really have heard this song a million times. I kept being like, what is uh like Darby Bay I asked her specifically, but there was like 10:30 and 3. I was like, what is 10:30 and 3? What does among 10:30 and 3 mean? I couldn't figure it out, and I like looked it up and was like, trying to figure it out, and finally we had a conversation about it, and I guess 10 horses. Okay, so horses among 10:30 and 3.
Yep.
10:30 and 3.
She's talking
What's
about
that? 330 horses or something?
yeah. Well, it's important. I'm gonna stop the screen share now. I hope everyone's gotten a chance to look at these lyrics, but there is a link in the chat box. Um, it is important, I think, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. But uh, it's important to remember that, like I said, these are this song in particular is has a relative that is centuries old, and so a lot of this is Old English, and then a lot of it gets has been like sort of transform into like old American English. So like a lot of changes have happened to these words, so they don't always make sense, which is part of the reason why I was so excited about this particular version that Bina Cooper sang, because it's pretty logical. Like if you read some other old ballads or hear other ballads, especially Americanized ballads, because um, those are known for being more abbreviated versions of these old English ballads because of the fact that they've been passed down, sort of out of context. Um, but this one is like surprisingly coherent and also a pretty powerful story. So it's just like couldn't believe my luck in coming across it. I was very excited to perform it.
Yeah, and it leaves a lot of room open for like metaphor.
Yeah, it's a
like
really beautifully preserved song. We're very lucky that we have this like preserved Blount County song, which is a great uh, sort of transition. I think Amy will speak next. Is that right? Or did I have? Yes, that's the great transition to Amy talking about this collection. Um, yeah, I'm excited to hear more about it as well because I just know what she and I have talked about when I came into the archive. So, Amy, if you'd like to take over and tell us a little
Okay.
bit more, I'm just gonna pin your screen, add a pen. All right.
Okay, so I am going to share my screen if I can get, oh, of course I didn't want to do that then. Let me pull it up. Zoom.
Is it letting you share?
Yes, now it is. It just took a second.
Okay.
Okay, so I will start here. So my name is Amy Lundell, and I am the archivist at Maryville College. So I am in charge of all the records and the artifacts pertaining to 202 years of Maryville College history. So I'll be talking about Oliver Hamby, Dorothy Horne, and their collection of ballads that we hold in the Maryville College Archives. And it is from this collection that Libby found the ballad 16 King's Daughters. And so we'll start with a little bit of background. We don't know exactly why, but in 1928, Writers' Workshop, which was a student organization that focused on literary composition, began collecting folk ballads particularly within the college itself. The students were interested in variations on different songs based on where the singer was from, whether a local student or a student from another state. For example, on December 15th, 1928, the organization presented a program of ballads during Novel Night Evening Chapel. This evening was used to inform the campus community of the project and to elicit ballads from the students themselves. And for the next 2 years, from 28 to 30, the Writers' Workshop collected over 90 ballads and shared these with the campus community as musical entertainment during literary society meetings and chapel services. There was even talk at the time of publishing a book of these ballads, but for some reason that initiative kind of dissipated after about 1930. We don't exactly know why. Unfortunately, this early collection of ballads was lost to time. But a few years later, in 1936, Maryville College hosted the third annual meeting of the Tennessee Folklore Society at Thaw Hall, which is our library now. Dr. Edwin Hunter, who was the head of our English department at the time, was vice president of the society. So he was the connection that brought the meeting to campus and helped set this up in Thaw Hall. You can see a little picture from our Echo article there. And during this meeting, another English professor from the college, Dr. Hillshine, decided to give a talk on ballads. We don't know what he said, but apparently it was quite interesting. Because Dr. Shine arrived in Maryville College a few years earlier, in 1932, from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Though his academic interests were primarily in early 19th century English literature, he was also very interested in local folklore. And it's through this folklore interest and his talk on ballads that he became connected with a Maryville College junior history major at Oliver Hamby. Okay, why is my screen not moving to the next spot? Not sure what's happening. Okay, I somehow just lost my mouse. I have no idea what it's doing. Okay, well, there we go. Got it to next screen. So this is Oliver Hamby. So he grew up in a small community outside of Murphy, North Carolina, in Western North Carolina, and he became familiar with folk ballads at a very young age. As a student here at Maryville College, he would often sing these ballads and play his mandolin at Athenian Literary Society meetings. And in 1936, following this big presentation and folklore society meeting on campus, he approached Dr. Hillshine to discuss gathering ballads from the local community. And the reason for this is during his time at Maryville College, he noticed similarities and differences between the ballads that he knew from the mountains of Western North Carolina and those here in Blount County. And with Dr. Shine's assistance, he began working in the local community to gather ballad lyrics. But he soon realized that it wasn't just the lyrics that were different, it was also the melodies. And though he was a musician himself, played the mandolin and sang, he wasn't professionally trained, so he could not read or notate music. And so Dr. Shine encouraged Oliver Hamby to reach out to Dorothy Horne, who had just been appointed a music theory professor at the college. So Dorothy Dewerson Horne was a native of Independence, Missouri. She had just joined the faculty at Maryville College to teach piano, violin, and music theory. In fact, in later years, she would become known as one of the best music theory teachers in the United States. But in 1936, however, she's just starting her teaching career, and she was approached by Oliver Hamby for assistance on this project. She gave an interview to another alum in 1990 and described kind of how this process worked. She said, Hamby was gifted in finding and getting cooperation from the country people and made appointments to visit and transcribe the remembered ballads. I would notate the music frequently on the back of the written ballad. And so they worked on this project for Hamby's junior and senior years at Maryville College, so 1936 to 1938. So here is an example from Oliver Hamby's handwritten notes. This is actually, excuse me, the third visit that Oliver Hamby made to Vina Cooper. And in this particular case, you can see at the top that Mrs. Horne was with him, or Miss Horne was with him. And number 5 on the list, they gathered the ballad 16 King's Daughters. It's up here. And in earlier notes from his first visit, he describes Mrs. Cooper. He said, practically all of the ballads that I got from Mrs. Cooper were good old ones, and most of them were fairly complete. Though Mrs. Cooper is about 50 or 60 years old, her memory is good. Especially significant and valuable was the fact that she seems not to have altered the ballads much by inserting words for those she didn't understand. Several words were found in the ballads that have no meaning at present. Still, she remembered them and gave them as they sounded, apologizing for not knowing the meaning. Sometimes she would give the meanings of words she thought I probably wouldn't understand. And so here's, as you've seen, the transcription. So the reason this is transcribed in typewritten is Maryville College had a printing department that was run by students. And Hamby and Horne and the college as a whole realized that this was a very valuable collection of ballads. And obviously there was that earlier collection that was lost, and they did not want that to happen again. So in this particular case, they had the students in the printing office transcribe all the ballads. So if there are any typos, it comes from the other students who are typing them up and copying them. That's also, Libby, why there were so many extra copies of some of these ballads. We discovered that when going through them. Some we had about 16 typewritten copies of the exact same thing. And obviously you see here the notes that of the connection to Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight. And once again, here is the melody line from 16 King's Daughters. You've got Vina Cooper's at the top and one of the additional ones there. And as I said, there were 2 to 3 other versions. She would take, Dorothy Horne would take ones from published materials. So if she could find the same ballad, say in Child's published ballads, or in even in other ballads that were given by other folks in Blount County, she would note those all together. So this photocopy is actually made from where she would literally cut out the pieces from the backs of paper and paste them together, and then they would photocopy them. And so that's why they're kind of slightly circled there on there. Those are the actual pieces of paper that were taped together so that she could compare the ballads. Though Oliver Hamby graduates in 1938 and goes on to become a Presbyterian minister in Alabama, and doesn't appear to continue with his research into ballads, it really sparked an interest for Dorothy Horne. She wrote an article on all of this research that was published in the November 1938 issue of the Tennessee Folklore Society Bulletin. It's called An Inquiry into the Musical Backgrounds of the Southern Mountains. And this really focuses on the variations in the tunes themselves for the common ballads in Blount County, as well as some that were published in other material. And this sparked an interest in local music and eventually for her, what became her lifelong passion, which is shape note tunes. Her personal and her academic research for the rest of her life would revolve around shape note hymnals and shape note singing, even into her doctorate from Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, that she received in the 40s. She would later publish a book, you can see it here, Sing to Me of Heaven, a study of folk and early American materials in 3 old harp books. Though she left Maryville College in 1953, after she retired, she came back to Maryville and continued to be heavily involved in the local community, especially in the local shape note singing organizations. And I'll close with some excerpts from her conclusion from her 1938 article on this ballad research, this project that they did. It is to be stressed again that this folk music is not static, but a living, changing art. The folk musician varies his tune not because he can't remember how he sang it last time, but because, in his way, he is an artist, and he elaborates or otherwise changes the tune to suit his mood, the occasion, or the words of subsequent stanzas. Since the singers were very patient and indulgent, the tunes given here can be vouched for as being exactly the way the song was sung one time by one person. Let these melodies then but serve to illustrate the deep-rooted musical forces which contribute to the folk music of our southern mountains. That's how she ends her article. And if you have any additional questions, obviously I'll take them now, but if you think of one later, there's my contact information as well as a link to information about the archives itself.
Hi, Amy. This is Anjanae. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What I wanted to, I sound like I'm in a, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I think you're broadcasting through that and this.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, sorry about the echo, but I wanted to ask, I did not get the interpretation of that song at all. And it says underneath the title, Lady Something and Elf King. What does that refer to?
Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight. I think Libby knows a little more about that part.
Yes. So well, I guess it's kind of two questions. So Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, that little sort of bracket is just referencing it back to its relative. So there was a man named Cecil Sharp, who he came over from England, and he documented, well, it's kind of controversial because his goal was to document specifically English ballads in the Appalachian Mountains, and to document the fact that there was like this direct lineage from the British Isles into Appalachia. Oh, sorry, one second. Just gotta image this person. And that's a little complicated because there was so much more happening there at that time. And like I said, like part of that was that there were local American ballads that were very common. People were singing about their lives. They were singing about current events. But because of Cecil Sharp's work, a lot of that wasn't of interest to people at the time. They were more interested in chasing these old English ballads. And so Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight is one of those ballads, and I believe it dates to Scotland, and that one is like, that particular version it's probably about twice as long, like the version that Cecil Sharp recorded, and by recorded I mean wrote notes. There weren't audio recordings at the time that he was collecting, and so this is sort of an abbreviated version. I don't know how it became abbreviated by Vina Cooper, but as we saw from Dr. Horne's notes, it could have been an intentional choice. Could have just been that that's how she learned it. She also could have, maybe she was trying to sing, who knows what her motivations were. Maybe she was like me and she was trying to frame this woman in a victorious way as opposed to having a bad ending, which was so common for women subjects in these ballads. We don't know. But anyways, it's different the way Vina Cooper sings it than it was back in Scotland 200 years before she was singing it. And the interpretation that we have now, if you open, I don't know if you can open that Google Drive to look at those lyrics. Maybe I'll share my screen one more time just so we can all take it in, because it is hard to catch it as it's going by. Oops. There we go. So he followed her up, he followed her down, he followed her to the bed where she lie. She had no wings to carry her away, or tongue to say no yea. Go get me my father's gold, and also my mother's fee. Go catch 2 horses in yonder stable among 10:30 and 3. So this is my interpretation, and that's the other thing is you can take this however you would like, but the way that I interpreted it, and then Anne's interpretation of it ended up in the film as well. But I see that as some intruder followed this woman to her bed, takes her away. She says, go get two horses in yonder stable among 10:30 and 3, maybe for them to ride. And in Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, this song's relative, it's an elf king who comes to get her, and I believe she's like bewitched. And so there's that also like mystic element in this if you wanted to put that there, but this particular version never talks about that. But in Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, she's bewitched essentially. Go get me my father's gold. Oh wait, I already said that one, sorry. He got on the liver grown black, she got on the Darby boy, either way. They rode till they came to the wide seashore 3 long hours before it was day. So there's no seashore in the mountains of Tennessee, right? So that's a direct reference from the old English version of this song. Come get off, my pretty pink, said he, into this room with me. 16 king's daughters I've drowned here, and the 7th you shall be. So also in Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, this song's relative, he does say 6. He doesn't say 16, but it's the ballad's title, so I couldn't change 16 to 6, even though it makes more sense. But it is 6 in this ballad's relative. And in that other ballad, he's kind of, I think I recall there's another verse where he's bragging about the fact that he's got all these women down here, and the twist in this one is that the woman fights him off and pushes him into the ocean. But the twist in the longer version is then the elf he's murdered and sent in the sea, and he's left to be those 7 women's husband for the rest of his days, for eternity. So it's like his punishment is that he has to be the husband of the 7 women who he's murdered, which is pretty brutal, if you ask me.
Wow.
So where are we? Come pull off your finest dressing and lay hit here by the side of me. It is too fine and too costly to rot in the foam of the sea. So he's like, your clothes are too nice. Might as well take them off. I will push.
Can I interject? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so in your thing it said, here it says, and lay hit here by the side of me. Mm-hmm. And when you sing it, you say, and lay it here by the side of me, or whatever. Sorry, you're the same. Yeah. And I struggled with that too in my captions, because I thought, well, she doesn't sing lay hit here, and I want to convey exactly what it sounds like, so I'm going to say lay it by the side of me, because and I thought that was another interesting, I just think it's great and so cool that we're talking about all these like choices that we made and why we made them, because totally. I made it for clarity and for being true to what you sang, and maybe this one is trying to be true to what Vina Cooper is saying.
Right, and it's similar to what Amy Lendell pointed out about Dr. Horne's quote, that this music is a living, breathing thing, and so if we decide to change a word for clarity, that's part of the tradition, if you ask me. So that's sort of my philosophy on traditional music. Is it's an artistic choice. You take the music, you respect it, you respect the history, but you can also make artistic choices to make it more true to you. Okay, so then she turned herself around and around, the green leaves plain to see. She picked him up most manfully like, and she throwed him into the sea. Lie there, you nasty dog. In another version of this song, she says, lie there, you false-hearted lover. But I like this version better.
Yes, I liked it too.
Lie there, you nasty dog, lie there in the place of me, for I think your dressing is none too fine to rot in the foam of the sea. So she's like, my clothes might be too nice to rot in the foam of the sea, but yours definitely aren't. She got on the liver grown black and led the Derby Bay. She got home to her father's home 2 long hours before it was day. And I believe I said father's house. Go put away my father's gold, also my mother's fee. Go put these horses in yonder stable among 10:30 and 3. And that's where I chose to end the ballad. There are 3 more verses. And part of the reason I chose to end it is because I wasn't sure if perhaps Vina Cooper went into another ballad, or if maybe Dr. Horne combined two. I later learned that this is part of another version of this ballad, these next three verses. But for artistic reasons, I chose to end the story there. But I'll leave these here so that you can read what it was that Dr. Horne recorded as the last three verses. I don't know what they mean. I could make some guesses, but anyways, so let's move on because I want to talk about Vina Cooper, and Tim Walker is going to do that for us from the Blount County Genealogical Society. So Vina Cooper is the woman who sang this ballad to Dr. Horne in 1938.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, I can't find.
Okay.
Oh, there you are. There you are.
Okay. I'm Tim Walker. I'm the president of the Blount County Genealogical and Historical Society, and we have our offices here at the library. And I was asked to do some research on Vina Cooper and her life, and maybe get a little bit better feel of the woman and what her life experiences might have been like. And what I have put together is a chronological listing of facts, and some of it may sound a little boring, but I think you put it all together, you kind of get a better feel for what kind of life this lady led. She was born in Blount County, and there's three different dates in 1876 or 1880 or 1881, and I think the 1880 date is correct. And the reason those dates are unknown is because she only had a second grade education. And also, at some point before she became 20, her mother had died. So she was, so far as I can tell, the last child born of her parents, who were Jim Heron and Margaret Stennett. And in 1900, she was living with her brother and two brothers and her father in Blount County. And about a dozen houses away in the census records in 1900, there was a man named Pearlie Newton Cooper, who was a resident there, is about the same age. Well, on June 16th of 1900, Vina gave birth to her first child, a daughter, and Lily. And she didn't get married till a month later. And even though the records indicate that Pearlie was the father, that's unknown at this point. We can assume that's the case, and that and Pearlie, his background was from an unusual family situation. He was born to a single mother around 1880, which was unusual for that time. And his name will show up as a Whitehead sometimes, and will show up as a Cooper sometimes. And but anyway, that kind of gives you there wasn't the best family situation in their early life. She went on to have more kids. In 1903, she gave birth to Maggie. In 1906, Oscar. 1907, James. And in 1909, she gave birth to a son named Roy. And the reason I bring him up was because he was born in North Carolina. And from what I can tell, Pearlie moved around a lot, doing different jobs. And so about that time, he was working as a lumberman. Sometimes he was in Cades Cove, sometimes he was in Western North Carolina. But anyway, the family was moving around. And whether I assume that she was living with them or moving with him at the time, but there's no way to really tell that. In the teens, the 20s, and the 30s, their kids completed educations from anywhere from the 3rd grade to the 6th grade, so that was about the highest education level any of their children achieved. They had another daughter born in North Carolina in 1911, a son born in 14, another daughter in 17, a son in 19. And in 19 was the first time, well, 17 actually was the first time there was any reference to Cades Cove, where they were actually living in Cades Cove. And, and I don't really see a tie to Cades Cove prior to that, even though they were nearby, more than likely in the Happy Valley area. In 1920, they were living in Cades Cove, and they were working a farm and with their children. Let's see, they continued to give birth till finally there was 11 kids born to this family, and the last one being born in 1923. And with all those kids and everything in 1923, 11, last one born in March. In October of 23, her and Pearlie divorced, which again was something unusual at that time. And so their divorce was final on October 2nd, 1923, and the divorce records indicated that he had a lady friend on the side, and 2 days after the divorce, the ex-husband and the husband's girlfriend became husband and wife. So there she was left basically raising the kids, and that was probably in the days before child support and stuff like that. So the kids ended up helping to support her. She was basically illiterate, did not have was never in any record I found had a job. So anyway, she was living with her kids. In 1925, she lost her first kid to pneumonia. And then her kids start marrying off. And then in 1929, again, going back to the type of husband she had, her ex-husband was killed in Blount County in a fight when he was stabbed with a knife. He died in the local hospital. And by 1930, she was living with some of her children in Alcoa. And when they moved exactly to Alcoa, I don't think it was much before that. And her son Earl was working in the aluminum plant at that time, and her son Roy was a farm laborer, and they were bringing in the money for the household. Moving on, several of her kids got married. By 1940, she's living on Cades Cove Road, paying $8 a month rent. And she's living with her sons, Roy and Dewey. And I think that's, Roy may be how they ended up connecting with the people at Maryville College, because he was a laborer working on the grounds at Maryville College at that time in 1940. And Dewey was working in a 10-cent store. They lived in Blount County for the rest of her life, and Vina finally died in January 5th, 1957, and after a 3-day bout with pneumonia, and she was living on the Sevierville Road at the time of her death. And that's gives you kind of a feel of the type of life she had. It was basically, she was taking care of her kids, and then her kids were taking care of her. And when I heard that song, it made me wonder what kind of person maybe her husband was, and why that song might have resonated with her. And anyway, that's about all I've got. I'm open for questions if anyone has anything else they'd like to discuss about her personal history.
Anyone?
I'm about to take this on next, but I do have a question that maybe you could answer. The Cades Cove Road where he ends up, what exactly is that? Where the Cooper Road meets the gold mine trail up around top of the world area? Because there's several people that end up in that exact area by 1940.
In 1940, I'd say a lot of that is people who came out of the coves due to the creation of the park.
Right.
they scattered all over Blount County. Even 2 miles from our courthouse, if you go out Court Street, it becomes Duncan Road after a while. There's a church on the left, and that church's original name was Cades Cove Memorial Baptist Church. And it was made up of a community of folks that were relocated from the Cove, and they started that church there. So
do you know what actual Cades Cove Road is referring to, though?
I'm sorry.
Do you know what the actual Cades Cove Road on the census is referring to? Like, what if that road specifically?
I'm not completely sure. There is a Cades Cove Road that still exists out of Townsend right now that goes up into Cades Cove. There was also a road from Maryville, whose route I'm not exactly sure of at this time, that was called Cades Cove Road. And I suspect they lived closer to Maryville at that time.
I can add in a little bit on that. There's a note in Oliver Hamby's notes that in 1938, she is living about 1.5 miles down off of Montvale Road. So that direction. And then also there would be another connection to the Cades Cove community. After she passes away, she's buried in a Cades Cove cemetery. And I know from my work with the Park Service that in order for someone to be buried in a Cades Cove cemetery after the creation of the park, they had to either be born in Cades Cove or be the child of parents born in Cades Cove. There is a note in Hamby's things that she did grow up in Happy Valley, but it doesn't say where she's born. But it's very possible, growing up in Happy Valley, that her parents had the connection. There are lots of Stennants and Herons in that area. And so that's probably an additional connection there.
One other connection is she had a child who died young before the creation of the park, who was buried at in that same cemetery, and she was buried near her.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. That was really great. It's really special to be able to learn more about her. And it makes me want to know more about all the other people that Dr. Horne collected songs from, because the records she took were really great. A lot of them had actual addresses that these people were at least at when she heard them singing. Whether or not they lived there, I'm not sure, but you can actually see the addresses of people in Maryville when they had their songs collected. But yeah, Vina Cooper, it's really great to hear about her, because I've spent so much time with that song and a few of the other songs that she sang for Dr. Horne. So thank you so much for sharing that. Does anyone have more questions for Tim Walker about the source of this song? If not, we can move on. Yeah, thank you so much. Much appreciated. So that brings us to our next and final speaker, and then I think we'll watch the film one more time, because now we have so much more information about it. I think it'll hit a little harder. But much like Vina Cooper's story, in my research of Blount County music, I've come across several instances of people who lived in the area that is now the Great Smoky Mountain National Park and moved down into the valley, Maryville, surrounding areas around Maryville within Blount County. And I was like, I want to know more about that story. So I've asked Dr. Aaron Astor here to tell us a little bit more about that migration of people and how it affected Blount County, because it's so interesting that in one county of Tennessee, there could be so many different experiences and so much change and movement just within this one county. From the people who lived in the mountains had very different lives, I'm sure, than the people who lived in Maryville. So I just think it's a really interesting part of Blount County history. So I'm going to turn it over and we can learn a little more about it. I'm just going to pin you.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. And thank you, Tim, especially for some of those comments on Vina Cooper. I've going to try to give some broader context to the people around her and Pearlie Cooper and what their experience might have been like as they grew up in the Cove and as they started to move away from the Cove, and why and where they settled where they did. I'm going to share, I have a PowerPoint here that I'm going to set it up here. I assume everybody can see the PowerPoint here.
Yes.
Okay. So, this is a story that is about physical geography. It's also about cultural geography. It's about mental geography. It's about where people imagine their home is, and where they, even when they are physically moved from their, as they may see it, ancestral home, it still has a special pull to them. Cades Cove, probably more than most other communities, in part because the memory of it was able to remain intact, even though the actual community did not. In fact, if you go to the Cades Cove Preservation Association, whose headquarters is at their office is at the Thompson Brown House, right near the museum, not far from the college campus. One of my favorite items you can buy there is this map here of settlers' home places in Cades Cove. This is obviously, you can't actually read it; it's too far away. But if you ever buy this thing, it's really neat because you can see where these families are. And what always struck me about it is that the date on the top says 1821 to 1999. Obviously, nobody lived here for 178 years. And these families have moved around in many of these places. But there was a sense in which some area tended to be where the Gregorys lived, or where the Birchfields lived, or where the Olivers lived. And of course, as many of them intermarried over time. And so you essentially have a vision of multiple generations on this map that had a fair amount of stability in terms of where you could find them. And yet there was also quite a bit of change of people moving in, moving out, moving around the Cove. And then, of course, leaving entirely at the end by the time that the park was created. Let me say a bit about the Cades Cove community. First of all, it was not the only place in what's now Smoky Mountain National Park where people lived. People lived all parts of the park, of the North Carolina or the Tennessee side, but Cades Cove was certainly the largest. Its peak population reached around 700 in 1850, and it stayed around that point through the middle of the 19th century. One of the things Durwood Dunn, who wrote probably the best sort of extensive social history of Cades Cove, pointed out many times that part of what kept it as a fairly healthy community was that it was a place where people moved in and people moved out. It was not a place where people only left. It was a place where you had kind of a regular movement of people, as was very common in Tennessee at the time. If you look at people who moved in the 1840s and 1850s, many of them had come over from Northeast Tennessee, from Carter County, for example, or Virginia or North Carolina. And then they or their children would move west. They'd move to Middle Tennessee, or they'd move to Missouri or Illinois, or they moved to Texas. It's a very common migration pattern of people who were coming into East Tennessee and then moving on. And of course, some of these families stayed put for a long period of time. That's the Oliver cabin, the original Oliver house on the left. And that is the Cades Cove Primitive Baptist Church on the right, which was really the center of the community for several decades. Now, beginning in the Civil War, there was a very slow decline of the community, and there were several causes of it. And each of these fed on each other, but they all ultimately lead to a community that starts to wither a bit, and as people physically have to move away. The first and the greatest shock, of course, is the Civil War itself. The Civil War was devastating to Cades Cove. It was a primarily pro-Union community, but it was attacked several times by pro-Confederate raiders. One of the leaders of the community, Russell Gregory, his gravestone says literally murdered by North Carolina rebels, which kind of gives you a sense of the personal nature of the war in the Cove. There certainly were some Confederate supporters, people like Daniel Fout, but they were in essence evicted, kicked out of the Cove by the end of the war. And so you had really a new generation of leaders who emerged in the years to come. But it was a devastating period. There were lots of people who were attacked by, sometimes just by bandits who were not necessarily loyal to either side of the war, who just simply wanted to hide out there. So those who had survived the war, the Civil War in Cades Cove, were understandably a little weary of outside influences for the time being. Um, Nevertheless, the community continued to grow. It continued to persist for the next few decades, but there started to be a few more pressures. One of which was something that you see more and more in Appalachia, which is the each generation, the size of farms got smaller and smaller because of the tradition of partible inheritance. They did not use primogeniture. You did not hand all of the farm to the oldest son. You divided up the farm amongst all of the children. And over time, that means each farm is going to get smaller and smaller as each generation goes. It's one of the reasons why people tend to move out if they can. But what happened here was that you began, particularly in the 1870s, this kind of vicious cycle where farmsteads, the soil was harder. There was not enough soil to really grow, to run a farm that you could live on. So people worked that soil even harder, result of which was to accelerate the process of erosion, which made the soil even less productive and made people work it even that much harder. And you could imagine the cycle continues on for several years until basically the soil is pretty much useless. And by the time you got to the end of the 19th and early 20th century, you have a lot of people encountering a state of economic desperation. And it's at this time that new employment opportunities appear, particularly in the form of the timber industry, thanks to the railroad, the Little River Railroad, the mass scale timbering of what's now Smoky Mountain National Park, which really takes off into the 1880s and 1890s and continues into the first few decades of the 20th century. This provides employment for a lot of people. They get work in timber camps in places like Elkmont or later on in Tremont or over in North Carolina. But of course, that means more and more people are moving away from their traditional family homesteads. As you got into the 19 teens, you also started to see with the presence of the aluminum company plant and also its Calderwood Dam, which is down, of course, right next to the edge of Smoky Mountain National Park along the Little Tennessee River. And this is another employment opportunity for people. But it also meant you had a lot of newer folks who were associated with the Calderwood Dam who were moving in, who did not necessarily have traditional kin ties to those in the community. It was another thing that was sort of leading it to fray a bit. Then you started to have talk of creating a national park. And that talk began in the really around the turn of the century, but accelerated in the teens and really picked up in the 1920s. One of the real questions during this discussion was whether or not Cades Cove would be included in the national park. Many of the settlers, many of the families there were led to believe that Cades Cove would be kept out of the ultimate boundaries of the Smoky Mountain National Park in the same way that Townsend and Wallen were. And this turned out to not be the case. So after 1927, which is when Tennessee passes a law that officially sort of creates and marks out the boundaries of the park, there's a great sense of betrayal among many of the people who had hoped that they would be able to stay. They've been promised they would be able to stay, and now that was no longer the case. If they wanted to stay, they would have to sign essentially 5-year leases, and it would be up to the National Park Service to decide if they could do that. Not surprisingly, this convinced many people to leave very quickly from 1927 on, and that accelerated into the 1930s. And I'll give you some numbers on that in just a minute. Of course, at the same time, the Tennessee Valley Authority comes in and expands the process of building dams, which on one level is providing employment, but in other places is, of course, flooding people out. So let me point out a few. So again, to explain sort of why people left, this was not a sudden process. It was something that had been going on gradually for decades, but then really accelerated, especially with the eminent domain essentially booting families out of the park in beginning at the end of the 20s and particularly in the 1930s, in a sense of these broken promises and park boundaries that were changing. One of the other real tragedies of this is that as people were moved out of the park in the 1930s and had to find new employment, it was the worst possible timing. It was the middle of the Great Depression. And so they had to find work at a time when work was scarce. The only work available for many was in perhaps some of the CCC camps that were involved in actually creating the park, or some WPA projects or TVA. There were very few other employment opportunities. Farming was also not much of an option because there was not as much arable land left. Kermit Cochran at the bottom was actually the last man to live in Cades Cove. He lived there until 1999. And he was he had several leases that allowed him to stay there and had to basically tend his property as long as the Park Service had okayed it, but that no one has lived in the park since then. Some data here, I actually went through extensively everybody on the census living in Cades Cove in 1930 and then tracked where all of them lived by 1940. And it's pretty striking. Actually, even turning the clock back to 1920, there were 581 people living there. So they had declined from 700 to 581. But by the time you got to 1930, there were only 424 people living there. And my guess is that most of those people who left in the last few years of the 20s, because that was when it was clear, after 1927, it was clear that they were not going to be able to stay in the Cove. But then between 1930 and 1940, by 1940, there were only 75 people left. And these were those who were left, who were allowed to stay, were often essentially working for the Park Service at that point. A handful of them were allowed to farm, but they were essentially given short-term leases. Now, of those 424 people lived in Cades Cove in 1930, 57% of them settled elsewhere in Blount County. Okay, I actually found where all of them lived, and it's pretty remarkable. They absolutely stayed in Blount County, and that is, to Libby's point, I mean, really one of the remarkable stories that if you look at other national parks that were created in the 30s, the Blue Ridge Parkway or Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, you had a similar process of eminent domain and families being booted out. In that case, a lot of those families moved a little further away. A lot moved to Charlottesville, for example, and became and worked for the University of Virginia. There were more employment centers that are further away. But here, so many of them stayed in Blount County. And in fact, many of them stayed as close to the park as you possibly could be. So in this, Vina Cooper herself being on Cades Cove Road, probably Happy Valley, right on the outskirts of the national park. Only 15% found they lived outside of Blount County. 9% had died. Most of them were elderly, had died in the 1930s. But I think it's remarkable that that of those who left, the majority of them stayed in the county. The common jobs, like I said before, they would get jobs for the WPA or CCC. The other main employment site was the aluminum company plant. Sometimes they worked directly at the aluminum company. Sometimes they worked for other mills throughout the county that were essentially contracted out to Alcoa. And a handful of them tried their luck at farming. Some communities that were particularly popular for destinations for a lot of these families, certainly some parts of Townsend and Walland, the southern part of Blockhouse Road, and then leading up over into Happy Valley, which makes sense because that, of course, leads you right up into the old Cooper Road, which is the back entrance to Cades Cove. But there also were some further away in the county, like down Old Niles Ferry around the Clover Hill community. So they didn't all necessarily stay right along the outskirts of the park itself. Vina Cooper, found her on the census 1920, 1930, 1940. Of course, Tim has already told this story, but here she was on the top here in 1920 with Pearlie Cooper living in Cades Cove. In 1930, Bell Street in Alcoa, where she is with her children. In the 1940s, she's back there to Cades Cove Road, living with some other families, as Birchfields and Codas. There's other families that were clearly former Cades Cove residents. So in a sense, her story is moving away and then sort of back. The pull of the mountains kept her quite close by. A couple other examples of people, just two other examples to mention. These were fairly typical. Will and Lizzie Gregory, for example. Of course, the Gregory family was very, very prominent in the Cove. They had settled around the Clover Hill community, which is in the western part of the county, near Binfield, not far from William Blount High School. They actually settled in what used to be called the Dunkard Church, which was a German Brethren church, and which is not terribly common around here, but there were certainly a few of them, certainly up in Virginia and obviously many more up in Pennsylvania. Later on is now called the Oakland Community Baptist Church. Will Gregory had worked for the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration, and the CCC. You could see that on the census as a carpenter, and so that's where they ended up. And that's the old Clover Hill Mill, which is one of the older mills in the county. Another family, George and Gracie Birchfield. Birchfield, of course, is another very, very common name of former Cades Cove residents. In this case, they had also left from 1930 to 1940. And George's son, John Luther Birchfield, this is his World War II draft card, where it shows that he worked, they lived in Walland, and he worked for Alcoa. You can see he works for the Aluminum Company of America. And this is very, very typical to see World War II draft cards of this nature. His sister Laura Birchfield tried to found work in Knoxville as a domestic servant and died of appendicitis in 1932. So she had left earlier, and you can it's hard to see it, but her, the next of kin to vouch for her was her father, still in the Cove. This relationship between the Cove and Knoxville or the rest of Blount County is an ongoing one, and you can see it here in the case of these people. Including those who tragically passed shortly afterwards. A couple last final things here about some of the legacies of this connection. Probably the most important enduring community institutions were churches and cemeteries. So the Myers Cemetery from Tuckaleechee Cove, Townsend, Myers family, another very, very prominent one. Below that, this church down here, this Lackness steeple, is the Coker Chapel Church, also in Townsend. Many members of the Tipton family and the Gregory's Myers attended the Coker Chapel Church in Townsend. Up here, Tim had mentioned this briefly before, what's now called, I think, Unity something Fellowship, but for a long time was actually called Cades Cove Baptist Fellowship and the Cades Cove Memorial Cemetery. And that's not in Cades Cove. That is just down near the quarry of Duncan Road, just really only about a mile south of the college. So it gives you a sense of how many people had moved there. And that bottom, of course, picture is a baptism. And many of the Creek's communities that simply had relocated. Old Piney Level Church was another one. Pleasant Hill Baptist Church, Peck's Memorial Methodist Church. These were some of the older churches. Some of them had some family who had moved out of the Cove much earlier and then welcomed more people in, almost like a chain migration. Others were, much more closely tied with former Cove residents. And of course, the cultural preservation of the Cove, the Cades Cove Preservation Association, which is logo at the bottom, they every year, of course, hold the Old Timers Day in Townsend, the fall festival, but they also go up to the Cove itself. And while there's lots of music there, it's also a time for families and descendants of them to go visit the graves of their ancestors there, to visit some of the old home places, and to keep some of that family traditions and those ties alive. So in a sense, what the story here of Cades Cove is one of a community that is alive in spirit, and alive really sort of genealogically, certainly in Blount County, but is, even if it is not physically in the actual Cades Cove community where their members had lived for so long. But I think does illustrate a unique relationship between a community that was essentially displaced but that persists in the memory of in the heritage of this larger county. So with that, I'll stop here. If anybody has any questions about any of this, but the larger context of the world where Vina Cooper had grown up, and some of the challenges that she had faced all years.
This is Tim Walker,
Yeah.
so you can hear me.
Yes.
One other thing I wanted to bring up is, and that was real good on the migratory stuff. And you got to understand, if you haven't researched it in the past, it wasn't like one family would move to another community. The migratory paths of our ancestors, they tend to move in large family groups. Cades Cove and Happy Valley, for instance, if you go back to where there's a lot of their folks come from, Carter County, Tennessee, up near Elizabeth. And even Happy Valley supposedly was named after the Happy Valley in Carter County up there because the geography was similar. And a lot of those families, the Borings, the Whiteheads, a lot of the Cables, all of those folks came down together from Carter County over the years. And that was in my own genealogy, I've seen that same thing. And that's usually a clue in genealogy, is you'll go back and you'll find who your neighbors were at the place they used to live, and see if you find some of those same families living in the new location. So just thought I would throw that out there as a point of reference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could see, and that exact process of those same clusters of families are moving again to Wallen, or moving to Townsend, or moving to other parts of Blount County. You know, the kinship ties are, I mean, you know, if you go to any cemetery, if you go to the Missionary Baptist Church or Primitive Baptist Church Cemetery in the Cove, I mean, you see the same names repeat as middle names. You know, you see someone such and such Birchfield Gregory and such Myers Birchfield, and so on. So, because of course they're all intermarrying. And there are some names like Heron that were, or Sands. There's a few others that they're not as common as the Myers and Gregorys and the Tiptons, but there were certainly other families too that came in. But what's striking about the Cove before and after the Civil War is that before the war, you had a lot more different families moving in and moving out. Towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th, you did not have as many people moving in anymore. And so the families that tended to exist there were the ones who were the only ones you can find left. Of course, the complication here is that there were people who lived on the edges around the Boring family. A lot of them lived sort of west of the Cove. And there were many who lived, the Paynes, for example, who lived in Happy Valley and lived there before the park was created. They were not actually dislocated. And of course, through intermarriage or what have you, some of them did, you know, the families did join together. But that's right, they're clusters of families that moved in a migration path. And for many of those who did go west, I mean, these are the folks that went to Texas or went to Missouri or went to someone up to Illinois, or Kentucky to Illinois.
Yeah, from a musical perspective, that's a really interesting pattern. And as I have started to dig more into this, I'm interested to see if it confirms my suspicion or not. But because so much of this family music is passed between community members, seeing from what I found so far, that movement out of the park kind of broke up the musical lineage to a certain degree. But there are like musical families, like the Harmon family, who I haven't mentioned yet, who were moved to Maryville from Cades Cove, for example. They continued to make music because they were moving with their families. So the Blount County is a really interesting study of mountain music as well, because people were broken up, but they tended to stay with their families, which meant that music could keep being shared. So I just think
absolutely, and it's both sacred and secular. I mean, you know, there are so many. You know, the Music Row Maryville for many years had these sort of get-togethers, and it was Hamby was the guy who ran it. You know, and you know, Jay Tipton, his band plays. I think they still play. I mean, they're I think Robinella is Tipton. You know, there's a lot of these families. They're musicians from this county that have their roots in the Cove, but you add to that, of course, the sacred tradition. Of course, the shape note singing that Dr. Horne studied, but also other forms of singing, church music that has kept, you know, gospel sound alive. I mean, there's incredibly rich sources of music in this county, and it's not all from the Cove. I mean, there are people whose family never lived there, but there were a lot who were. One other thing to point out too, because this often comes up when talking about the roots of this music, is that this was actually an ethnically mixed group of people. This is not, I mean, not ethnically all within Europe, but they're not all Scots-Irish. You know, people say, oh, they're all Scotch-Irish. They're not. There's actually a lot of them are German. I mean, Boring is a German name. Cables was a German name. A lot of them were just English. There were French Huguenots like Lequire. Most of them came from Pennsylvania. They came from Pennsylvania and then down the Valley of Virginia into North Carolina, and then over to Carter County, which is Northeast Tennessee, and then down here. That's a very common migration path. You had many who were Scots-Irish, Northern Irish Presbyterians, and then you had many who were Germans of various religious backgrounds, and many of them would intermarry and some would not. That's a big part of the settlement of Appalachia and makes it fairly typical. And the reason I bring that up is because when we look for the roots of a lot of the sound of the music, there tends to be an extra emphasis on either Elizabethan era English, or on one hand, or this sort of, purely Scots-Irish thing on the other. And of course, those are important, but there were other forces as well, like I mentioned, Germans as well, that were part of that cultural heritage, including musically, by the way, part of that cultural heritage that really has to be considered. I mean, most of these folks, their ancestors had come to North America at the latest, the 1750s. So most of them had arrived here. Well, I should say maybe the 1760s. Most of them arrived, their ancestors probably between the 1720s and 1760s, mostly into Pennsylvania, and then drifted very quickly south and west from there. And so they were already 2 or 3 generations in America by the time they're in Cades Cove. And had largely mixed sort of ethnically, so to speak, into the back country. And of course, some Cherokee as well.
Definitely. Yeah, it's sort of, well, actually, because I want to talk about this a little bit more, but in case anyone has to go as we reach 8:30, I put a form in the chat. It's a little survey. It would help us a lot with our grant if people wouldn't mind filling it out. But anyways, back to that point. Yeah, it's really interesting because there's this myth about, especially like musically, about Appalachian music, that it's this static, like pure thing from England. And that's just not the case. And it's actually like that idea has been very harmful to the documentation of that music. Like I said, there's so many, especially with ballads, like so many local ballads that told of current events, like local knowledge that, as far as I know, have been lost because those weren't the pure English ballads that folklorists were looking for.
Right. Well, the Sharps, I mean, the song catchers. So we talked about Sharp, Cecil Sharp, and you see a similar thing with those who collected, blues music from Mississippi in the 1920s, collected from Robert Johnson, that they're only looking for certain kinds of sounds. You can see some of that in the early Smithsonian Folkways recordings, where they have this idea in their mind of what counts as authentic and what's not. And you see that architecturally too, when they create Smoky Mountain National Park, those folks who lived there had modern homes. They were built at the time. They were built in the 1910s and 20s. Okay, it's often with modern furnishings, and those furnishings were destroyed, and the only things that were left behind were ones that looked like they were a century old, the 1830s, because that created a feel. This was a this sense of Appalachia was actually invented there. It was created there by the Park Service, and you see the same thing in Shenandoah National Park and the Blue Ridge Parkway, where this was a living community that was essentially just it was destroyed. I mean, at least in terms of physical. I mean, not its sort of kinship, as we've talked about, but it's the physical, product of it was destroyed, and then almost turned into a mascot. I mean, turned into this very, very 1830s era, as if they always lived in this sort of quaint, simple life. And it was a hard life, but I mean, they valued progress. They valued any kind of new experiences like anybody else. And so with music, they would alter traditions just like anybody else would.
Yes. And that's why the quote that Amy shared from Dr. Horne was like, just gave me chills. Like the quote that she said, I'll just read one more bit of it before we return to the film. But it is to be stressed again that folk music is not static, but a living, changing art. And that's just so true. And that's part of the reason why my musical choice was to honor the song, but to bring in more modern sounds, because that's folk music.
That's right.
And it's a myth that it is this static thing that is some sort of preservation. It doesn't need to be always a historical performance. Like, I love honoring that more than anyone, but I think the biggest service you can do is help it move along and move into the modern world so that it keeps going, which I think is a good transition into the final viewing of the film. We'll just watch it one more time, but does anyone have anything to say before we wrap this up? I'll say one more thank you before we go after the film, but thank you so much to everyone who spoke, and especially like just so generous of you all to make time to do this. Thank you to the Blount County Friends of the Library for working with me on this project, and for the Tennessee Arts Commission for giving us a grant so that Anne could make this beautiful film. And thank you so much to Amy at Maryville College for helping me navigate the Horne and Hamby collection. I'm excited to work with it more. I hope to do more with it. Yeah, just thank you so much to everyone. Anne, would you like to fire up the film?
I sure would.
And
It's
while
been
she's
really
that,
wonderful listening to all you and learning
it's
more
so
about the
great.
area.
It's just Blount County is just like, honestly, it has such a rich history. I feel like I didn't realize that when I was growing up, so it's my mission to like try to get that out there.
Yeah, and I heard one of the people that Amy shared right before Dr. Horne was born in Murphy or lived in Murphy, and I have family. My dad's side of the family is from Hayesville, right beside Murphy, North Carolina. So I have a connection to that area. I have a big connection to that area.
He was from, I think it was Unaka,
Okay.
UNAK. That's where he was from. Unaka, yeah.
Yeah.
That was the other collector, right?
Yes, that was Oliver Hamby. It was kind of his brainchild that started all of this, and then the working with Dr. Horne, who just kind of became obsessed with it and continued on.
Okay.
And before we finish, like I said, there's if you could fill out that form for me that I put in the chat link, it's to help with our grant, but also if I get your email address, I won't bother you at all, but I would love to send the lyrics as well as the YouTube link to the film. The film will also be available to check out at the library on DVD. I feel like it's a cool thing for kids. If you have kids who might be interested, it'll be captioned. Anyways, okay.
All right. I will go ahead and share then, if that's cool. And Libby, if you could chime in verbally if there's a problem with the sound or picture, that'd be great. Otherwise, I'm going to mute and turn off my video and assume everything is going great.
Okay, great.
But first, let's see. Okay.
All right, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Beautiful film, Anne. Yeah, great job.
Thank
And
you all for being here, and thank you for making this possible, and thank you, Libby, for making this glorious music.
Yes, thank you.
yay. Well, unless
Libby, this
yes,
is Anjanae from the Blount County Public Library, and we would just like to say thank you very much for seeing a passion and something that had local relevance and historical value to so many, and making this video and this program possible. It is because of your interest and your passion that you helped through the financial support of the Tennessee Arts Commission, as well as the support of the Blount County Public Library's Friends of the Library. So I just want to say the library feels honored to be a part of this program, and we thank you. And yeah, thanks so much. Anytime you want to partner, you give us a call.
great. Yay, we love the Blount County Library. They're the best. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great night. Check out the form in the chat if you can. That's all. Thank you so, so much. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.